Have you ever had that feeling where you just really want to, like, get to the bottom of something? Not just, like, skimming the surface, but really figuring out what's going on, the core of it all.
Yeah, like a deep dive.
Exactly, like a deep dive into these kind of fundamental questions, which is basically what philosophy is all about, right?
No, absolutely. Getting right to the heart of the matter.
And that's what we're going to do today, because you, our listener,
Hmm.
said you were really interested in this whole acting as philosophers idea. So we thought, what better topic to really use this approach with than creativity?
It's a great one. I mean, creativity is something we all kind of use and experience every day, right? From like big artistic things to just figuring out clever solutions to little problems.
Totally.
But if you really start asking, what is it? What makes something creative? You find yourself bumping into some pretty deep philosophical questions.
For sure. And so to guide us through this whole exploration, we've got this incredibly detailed entry on creativity
Yeah.
from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Oh, yeah, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's a treasure trove.
It really is. And it's not just like a quick definition. This entry is huge. It covers like centuries of thought on creativity, from historical perspectives all the way to the latest in cognitive science.
Even AI.
Yes, even the question of whether computers can be creative. So our mission today is to pull out like the most fascinating philosophical insights from all of this. We want to understand what creativity is at its core, how it works, and why it even matters so much. You wanted to act as philosophers, and trust me, creativity is like the perfect topic for that kind of deep questioning.
Yeah.
So let's dive in.
Let's.
So where do we even begin with something like this?
Well, maybe we can start by looking back a bit, at the history of how philosophy has thought about creativity.
Okay.
It might surprise you to know that even though creativity seems so essential to what makes us human, it actually hasn't always been a major focus in philosophy.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, thinkers like Plato and Aristotle definitely touched on some aspects related to creativity, and Kant discussed genius and things like that. But philosophy of creativity as its own distinct field. It's a pretty recent development. Even the word creativity as an abstract noun, that didn't really become common until the 19th century.
Wow. That is surprising. You'd think something so crucial to human experience would be like front and center for philosophy all along.
You would, but it really wasn't until the last couple of decades that philosophers have really started zeroing in on the specific questions about creativity itself, separating it from more general discussions about art and beauty.
Okay, that makes sense. So while aesthetics might ask, what makes this beautiful or what makes this art, the philosophy of creativity is more like, what makes this creative?
Precisely. It's a more targeted focus.
So is it simply about being new,
Mm.
or is there something more to it?
Right. And it's interesting how many different ways we use the word creative, right?
Totally. We talk about creative people, creative processes, creative products, and those products can be anything. A painting, a scientific theory, even just a new way of thinking about something.
Absolutely. And this is one of the first things the Stanford Encyclopedia entry points out. Creative can be applied to a person, a process, or a product. And those products can be ideas, performances, artifacts, all sorts of things.
Yeah, makes you realize just how broad this concept is. So when we start thinking like philosophers about what it takes for something to be creative, what are those like essential ingredients?
Well, the first one that almost everyone agrees on is novelty.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Something can't be creative if it's just a copy, right? It's got to be new in some way.
Exactly. And that seems pretty straightforward at first. But even this idea of newness gets a bit more complicated when you look closer.
How so?
The entry brings up a really useful distinction made by Margaret Bowden between what she calls psychologically creative, or P creative, and historically creative, or H creative.
P creative and H creative. Okay, what's the difference?
So something is P creative if it's new to the person who created it, regardless of whether someone else has already come up with the same thing. Like imagine Newton discovering calculus. Obviously, he wasn't the first to ever understand calculus, but for him, it was a genuinely creative act.
Right, because he came to that understanding on his own, even if others had already figured it out before him.
Exactly. Or think about a student who's learning about philosophy for the first time and they work through the arguments for compatibilism and really grasp it. For them, that's a creative act, even though the ideas themselves have been around for a long time.
Oh, I see. So it's about that individual's process of discovery and making something new for themselves, even if it's not new to the world.
Exactly. It highlights how creativity isn't just about, changing the world or making huge contributions to society. It's also about those personal aha moments, those individual leaps in understanding.
And I guess that's why peak creativity is considered more fundamental. Because if something is creative, like truly new in the entire history of humanity, it must have also been peak creative for the person who first came up with it.
Exactly. It has to be new to someone first before it can be new to everyone.
Right, so the individual spark is always there at the beginning.
Mm.
Okay, so novelty is key, but is that all it takes? Is anything new automatically creative?
Well, that leads us to a much trickier question. Does something also have to be valuable to be creative?
So now we're getting into the really juicy philosophical debates.
We are. Some philosophers say that while creative things often are valuable, value shouldn't be part of the actual definition of creativity.
Interesting. Why not?
Well, they argue that including value doesn't really help us understand how or why something is creative. It's like saying a car is a valuable invention, but that doesn't explain how the engine works.
Right, the value of a car is
Wow.
separate from the mechanics of how it functions. So you're saying it's the same with creativity. The value of a creative product is separate from whatever makes it creative in the first place.
Right, and they might also point out that we often use creative as a compliment, like, oh, that's a creative solution. But that doesn't automatically mean that positive value is built into the very concept of creativity.
Okay, so that's one side of the argument. But then there's the other side that says, no, value is essential to creativity.
Right, exactly. They'd say that creative, much like progress, is a word that's inherently tied to value. We don't call every change progress. It has to be a change for the better.
So maybe we shouldn't call every new thing creative. It should be new and somehow good or beneficial.
That's the idea.
What's the reasoning behind that view?
It often comes down to how we actually use the word creative in everyday language. Usually when we say something is creative, we mean it as praise. We're suggesting it's clever, ingenious, that it has some positive contribution.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But then doesn't that run into a problem when we think about things like, immoral creativity?
Yes. That's the big challenge for this view. If something is novel and skillfully done, but it's used for harmful or unethical purposes, can we still call it creative?
Right, like the entry gives those unsettling examples. Creative accounting, to commit fraud, giving cleverly misleading testimony, even disturbing stuff like thinking up new methods of torture.
Yeah, those are tough examples because if someone can be clever and innovative in those ways, does that mean they're creative even though what they're doing is morally wrong?
It really pushes you to think about how we define this whole concept. So how do the philosophers who insist that value is essential to creativity deal with these kinds of cases?
Well, some try to argue that truly creative acts just can't be inherently bad.
But that feels a bit like just like defining the problem away, doesn't it?
It can. Evil creativity doesn't strike most people as a contradiction, so others try to kind of refine the value condition.
Oh, okay. How so?
For example, Livingston suggests that maybe the new thing just needs to be instrumentally valuable. In other words, it's effective at achieving its purpose, even if that purpose itself isn't morally good.
So like a new method of torture could still be considered creative if it's really effective at what it does, even though torture itself is obviously horrible.
Yeah, that's the idea. It's about effectiveness within its own category, rather than any broader ethical value. And then you have Gott, who proposes this idea of something being good of its kind.
Good of its kind. Okay, what does that mean?
Well, it means that something can be creative if it excels within its own specific category, even if that category itself is morally questionable. Like a new propaganda technique might be considered creative if it's particularly effective at swaying people, even though propaganda itself can be used for very harmful purposes.
So it's not about being good in a moral sense, but about being good at what it's designed to do, even if what it's designed to do is bad.
Exactly. And then there are philosophers like Hills and Bird who go even further. They argue that something doesn't need to be good in any way to be creative.
Really? So even if something is completely useless or harmful, it could still be creative.
That's their position. They use this thought experiment of a super complex torture device that, because of a design flaw, doesn't actually cause any suffering.
That's an interesting example.
They argue that this device could still be considered creative because of its novelty and the ingenuity of its design, even though it fails to achieve its intended bad purpose.
Wow, that's really pushing the boundaries of how we usually think about creativity. But it makes you question whether our judgments about whether something is good or bad might be separate from our judgments about whether it's creative.
Absolutely. It forces us to really examine our assumptions. And it brings us to this idea that maybe we shouldn't just focus on the product of creativity, but also on the process that led to it.
Okay, so we're shifting from what's created to how it's created.
Right. Some theorists say that for a product to be considered truly creative, it can't just be new. It has to come about through a particular kind of process.
Interesting. So what are some of those key process conditions that have been proposed?
Well, the entry highlights four main ones. First, there's surprise. Bowden, for instance, talks about what she calls exploratory creativity, where you're working within a defined conceptual space, like a set of rules, and you come up with something unexpected or surprising within that space.
Okay, can you give an example?
Sure, think about the rules of chess. Within those fixed rules, there are endless possibilities for surprising and novel moves.
Ah, so it's like you're working within constraints, but still finding ways to be creative and surprising.
Exactly. Bowden argues that even within something like the rules of English grammar, you can create these unexpected and interesting combinations, like Dickens's really vivid description of Scrooge. It's surprising, maybe even a bit improbable, but it still fits within the established framework.
So you're playing with the rules and pushing the boundaries, but not breaking them entirely.
Right. And Nane adds this interesting subjective element. He suggests that what matters isn't just the actual recombination or transformation itself, but whether the creator experiences the process as surprising or transformative.
Oh, so it's not just about the outcome, it's about how the creator feels during the process.
Yeah.
That sense of novelty or unexpectedness is part of what makes it creative for them.
Exactly. Okay, so the second process condition is originality.
Originality. That seems pretty self-explanatory, right? If something's
well-
just a copy of something else, it's not really creative.
Right. The entry actually mentions Ada Lovelace's famous skepticism about computers ever truly originating anything, which we'll come back to later when we talk about AI.
Oh yeah, that's a whole other can of worms. But for now, we're still on process conditions. So we've got surprise and originality. What's the third one?
Spontaneity. This is the idea that a creative idea should kind of arise on its own, without being directly planned or controlled.
So it's not like you set out with a specific goal in mind and just execute it step by step. It's more about allowing space for unexpected ideas to emerge.
Exactly. Kronfeldner argues that if you could perfectly predict the outcome from the very beginning, it wouldn't really be a creative leap. It's like those eureka moments, those flashes of insight, where the solution seems to just pop into your head out of nowhere.
Yeah, we've all had those moments where we're struggling with a problem and then suddenly the answer just appears.
Exactly. And that sense of suddenness and unexpectedness is a key part of what makes it feel creative. Okay, and the fourth process condition is agency.
Agency, meaning that the creative product has to be created by someone, an intentional agent.
Right. A lot of philosophers emphasize this distinction between things that are created by humans and things that just occur naturally. Like a snowflake might be unique and intricate, but we don't usually call it creative, right?
Yeah, because it wasn't made by someone with a specific intention. It just formed that way based on the laws of physics.
Exactly. Gott is a big proponent of this agency requirement, and many others agree. They argue that for something to be creative, it has to be the product of a conscious mind, someone who's making choices and shaping the outcome.
It makes sense. It's like that example of the snowboarding tracks in the entry. The pattern might be totally unique and interesting to look at, but because the snowboarder's main goal wasn't to create that specific pattern, we wouldn't really call it a creative act.
Right. It was a byproduct of their actions, not the intended outcome.
But the entry also points out that not every philosopher buys into this whole agency requirement. Some are willing to say that natural phenomena can be creative, even without a conscious creator.
Yeah, that's an interesting counterpoint.
It makes you wonder, like, if we saw a perfectly symmetrical arrangement of stones on a beach, would we assume someone carefully placed them there and therefore call it creative? And if we later found out it was just the tide that did it, would that change our judgment?
That's a great example. It shows how our assumptions about agency can really influence our judgments about creativity. And the entry highlights another interesting consequence of these process conditions. If any of them are truly necessary for creativity, then even when we're just judging a finished product, we're implicitly making assumptions about how it came to be.
Oh, I see. It's like we see a painting and say, that's creative, but we're also assuming that a person created it intentionally, using their skills and imagination.
Exactly. If we later found out the painting was actually generated by a random algorithm, we might rethink our judgment about its creativity, even if we still find it visually appealing.
That's fascinating. It shows how our understanding of creativity is tied to our beliefs about how things come into existence.
It is.
Okay, so we've explored creative products and creative processes, but the entry also dives into this question of whether creativity can be a characteristic of a person. Specifically, can it be seen as a virtue?
Yeah, that gets into some really interesting territory. Some people think of creativity as simply an ability. You either have it or you don't. But others say it's more than that. It's a disposition, a tendency to act in creative ways when the situation calls for it.
Like a personality trait?
Exactly. And if it's a trait, then we can ask, is it a good trait? Is it a virtue?
Ah, like courage or wisdom.
Right. And the entry refers back to Aristotle's framework for understanding virtues.
Which was? Remind me again.
Well, Aristotle said that for an action to be truly virtuous, you have to know that you're doing it, you have to choose it for its own sake, and it has to come from a firm and unchanging state of character.
Okay, right. So how does creativity stack up against those criteria?
Well, that last one, the firm and unchanging state, is a bit tricky. Like, think about the poet Rimbaud. He basically abandoned poetry in his early 20s. Does that mean he wasn't a creative person?
Good point. It seems like creativity doesn't necessarily have to be a lifelong, permanent thing to be a significant part of who someone is.
Right. But the first two criteria, knowledge and choosing it for its own sake, those raise some interesting questions.
Because to be creative, you have to be aware of what you're doing and make choices, which ties back to that idea of agency we talked about earlier.
Exactly. But the for its own sake part, the idea of intrinsic motivation, that's where a lot of the debate lies.
So is it enough to be creative for any reason, or do you have to be driven by a genuine love of the creative process itself?
That's the question. Kieran, for example, argues that while what he calls minimal creativity might be fueled by external factors, truly great creative achievements require intrinsic motivation. He says there's this love of the act of creation itself that drives those who achieve exemplary levels of creativity.
Mm. It's like the difference between doing something because you enjoy it versus doing it for a reward or to impress someone.
Right. And Kieran even points to psychological research that suggests intrinsic motivation is more conducive to creativity, while focusing on external rewards can sometimes backfire. Like, there's this classic study where they gave kids magic markers to play with.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that one.
The kids who were promised a reward for drawing actually ended up being less creative than the kids who just drew for the fun of it.
Interesting. So it seems like focusing on external rewards can actually stifle that natural creative spark.
That's what the research suggests. But then the entry also presents a counter-argument. It points out that there are also studies where rewards did lead to increased creativity. And it gives real-world examples of huge creative achievements that were clearly driven by things like competition, financial incentives, even just the pressure of a deadline.
Right. Like a lot of scientific breakthroughs are made because researchers are competing for funding and recognition.
Exactly. And artists often create their best work under the pressure of a commission or an exhibition. So Gott, for instance, argues that while intrinsic motivation might often lead to creativity, it might not be strictly necessary for it, unlike in something like generosity, where the very definition of the virtue hinges on the motivation behind the act.
So we might admire a creative work more if we know it was driven by pure passion, but that doesn't mean it's not creative if it was driven by something else.
Right. And he brings in this whole other perspective from virtue epistemology, which basically defines a virtue as a reliable way of achieving a desired outcome.
A reliable way of achieving a desired outcome.
Okay. Yeah, so Zagzebski argues that creativity can be seen as an epistemic virtue. In other words, it's a reliable way of generating new knowledge and understanding. It might lead to some mistakes along the way, but overall, it's a valuable tool for advancing knowledge.
So it's not about being morally good or intrinsically enjoyable. It's about being effective at producing knowledge. That's a really interesting way of looking at it.
It is. It shifts the focus from internal feelings to external results.
Okay, so we've talked about what makes something creative, whether value is important, the different processes involved. But there's another big question that often comes up. Can creativity actually be learned?
Ah, yes, the age-old nature versus nurture debate.
Exactly. Some people seem to think that true creativity, like that real genius level stuff, is just something you're born with.
Right. And the entry points out that this view has a long history. Jung, for example, used this analogy of a plant. He said that original work grows naturally from the inherent nature of genius, like a plant grows from a seed. It's not something you can force or manufacture.
And Kant had a similar view, right? He saw genius as this innate gift, this special ability to create truly original works without following rules or imitating others.
Exactly. It's a very romantic notion, this idea of the solitary genius who just possesses this inexplicable spark of creativity.
It is. But Gott pushes back against these arguments.
He does. He says that not all learning is about imitation. We also learn through direct experience, through trial and error, through figuring things out on our own.
That's true. We don't just copy everything we see and hear. We learn by doing and experimenting.
Right. And even when we do imitate, like a child learning language, we're not just mimicking sounds. We're internalizing patterns and rules and then using those to create completely new sentences that we've never heard before.
That's a good point. Learning language is actually a pretty creative process when you think about it.
It is. And as for this argument that creativity can't be rule-based, Gott distinguishes between strict algorithms, which can be very limiting, and heuristics, which are more like rules of thumb.
Okay, rules of thumb versus strict algorithms. What's the difference?
Well, an algorithm is a set of instructions that you follow step by step to get a specific result. But a heuristic is more like a guideline or a suggestion. It gives you a general direction to follow, but it doesn't dictate every step.
So heuristics leave more room for creativity and flexibility.
Exactly. And the entry gives examples of heuristics in different fields, like show don't tell in writing or consider extreme cases in math. These aren't strict rules, but they're useful strategies that can help you think more creatively within those domains.
It's like they give you a framework, but you still have to use your own judgment and creativity to fill in the details.
Right. And even in philosophy, there are heuristics. Hayek, for instance, talks about philosophical heuristics as tools for generating new arguments and counterexamples.
So even something as abstract as philosophy can benefit from these creative strategies. That's really interesting.
It is. It suggests that while you might not be able to teach someone to be a genius in the way Kant imagined, you can certainly help them develop their creative abilities by teaching them these kinds of flexible guidelines and giving them opportunities to practice.
Okay, so we've explored a lot of ground here. What creativity is, how we value it, the processes involved, whether it's a virtue, whether it can be learned. Now, the next big question seems to be, can creativity be explained? Can science really get to the bottom of how we create?
That takes us into some really deep questions about the nature of creativity itself, and whether it's even something that science can fully grasp. Historically, there have been those who believe that creativity is fundamentally beyond the reach of scientific explanation. Like Plato, through Socrates, famously argued that poets create not through learned skill or knowledge, but through divine inspiration.
Ah, like the muses whispering in their ears.
Exactly, and it's important to note that this wasn't seen as just a metaphor. Plato literally believed that poets were possessed by these divine beings who gave them their creative powers.
Wow. So if the source of creativity is seen as supernatural, then science, which studies the natural world, wouldn't be able to explain it.
Right, and this idea of supernatural inspiration has had a long and influential afterlife. The ancient Roman concept of a genius originally referred to a kind of guiding spirit that gave a person their creative abilities.
Huh, I never knew that. So even though later thinkers like Kant and Schopenhauer moved away from explicit divine intervention, they still emphasized these innate, almost inexplicable capacities for imagination and aesthetic judgment, which seem to defy easy scientific analysis.
Yeah, there's this sense of mystery and awe surrounding creativity that's hard to capture in purely scientific terms.
But the entry points out that even if we acknowledge innate predispositions, modern genetics and neuroscience are showing how these interact with environment and experience.
For sure. It's not as simple either.
And just because creators themselves often can't explain how they come up with their ideas, doesn't mean that the underlying cognitive processes can't be studied scientifically. It's like we don't have to consciously understand how our digestive system works in order for scientists to study it.
That's a great analogy. And Kahnfeldner makes a strong case that creativity is even compatible with causal determinism.
Meaning that every event has a cause, and there's no such thing as free will.
Right. He argues that the kind of novelty that matters for human creativity, that psychological and historical newness, doesn't require breaking the laws of nature. Creativity isn't about, like, conjuring something out of nothing. It's about originality and spontaneity, which might rule out certain kinds of causes, like copying or routine application of rules, but doesn't rule out causal explanations altogether.
So even if every thought and action has a cause, there's still room for genuine creativity.
Exactly. And that's where cognitive science comes in. It can investigate the complex interplay of factors that lead to these novel and valuable outcomes without needing to appeal to supernatural explanations.
And speaking of cognitive science, it sounds like this is a field that's been really busy studying creativity in recent decades.
Oh, yeah. Since Guilford's famous call for more research in the 1950s, there's been a huge surge of empirical investigation into how people are creative. And the basic approach here is to see creativity as a natural phenomenon, something that can be studied scientifically, just like any other aspect of the mind.
And it's not just about art anymore, right? It encompasses all sorts of creative endeavors.
Hmm.
Science, technology, even just everyday problem solving.
Exactly. And they're studying both big C creativity, like the kind we associate with geniuses, and little c creativity, which is more about the everyday ways we come up with new ideas and solutions. Like Prince and Barsalou argue that even something as basic as forming new concepts is a creative act.
Wow, so we're all creative in some way, even if we don't think of ourselves as artists or inventors.
Right. And to try and break down this complex process of creativity, cognitive scientists often use these stage models.
Stage models, like breaking it down into steps.
Exactly. The entry talks about the Genoplore model, which focuses on the generation and exploration of ideas, and Wallace's really influential four-stage model: preparation, incubation, illumination, and verification.
Oh yeah, I've heard of that one. So you prepare by learning about the problem, then you kind of let it simmer in your unconscious mind during incubation, and then bam, you get that flash of insight during illumination.
Right. And then you verify or test out that insight to see if it actually works. The entry actually presents a more detailed five-operation version, adding generation and externalization to the mix, and it even gives examples from the working processes of real artists, like Jacob Lawrence with his storyboards, or Toni Morrison talking about her writing process, to illustrate these stages in action.
Cool. So these models are like a roadmap for understanding the different phases of the creative process, from the initial spark of an idea to its final realization.
Right. And the entry also stresses the importance of problem finding as part of the creative process.
Problem finding.
Yeah.
So it's not just about solving problems, it's about identifying the right problems to solve in the first place.
Exactly. Einstein and Infeld have this great quote where they say the formulation of a problem is often more essential than its solution.
Makes sense. If you're not asking the right questions, you're not going to find the right answers.
Exactly. And of all these stages, generation and insight seem to be the ones that have historically been the most mysterious and difficult to explain.
Yeah, those are the parts that feel the most magical. Like, where does that spark of inspiration come from? How does that sudden aha moment happen?
For sure. So, for the generation of ideas, there's this theory called blind variation and selective retention, or BVSR for short.
Blind variation and selective retention. Okay, what's that all about?
It was first proposed by Campbell and then expanded by Simonton. Basically, it says that creative ideas come from generating a wide range of possibilities, kind of like throwing a bunch of spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks.
So it's a bit like a trial and error process.
In a way, yeah. But Simonton emphasizes that this blindness isn't completely random. It's more like you're exploring a space of possibilities, but you're not doing it completely blindly. You're guided by your knowledge and experience, even if you're not consciously aware of it.
Oh, okay. So it's not like you're just randomly generating ideas out of thin air. There's still some underlying structure to it.
Right. And interestingly, neuroscience is starting to explore the default mode network in the brain, the DMN, as a potential neural correlate for this kind of free-flowing associative thinking that can lead to new ideas.
So when our minds are wandering or daydreaming, we might actually be laying the groundwork for creative breakthroughs.
That's the idea. And imagination plays a big role in generation too, obviously. It allows us to explore possibilities beyond the constraints of immediate reality.
Right, to picture things that don't exist yet, to play with different scenarios in our minds.
And then there's a whole phenomenon of incubation.
Incubation, yeah. The idea that sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to just step away from it for a while and let your unconscious mind work on it in the background.
Exactly. And we've all heard those famous anecdotes about scientists and artists who had breakthroughs after taking a break, like Newton's apple or Kekule's dream about the benzene ring.
Yeah, or Archimedes jumping out of the bath shouting, "Eureka!"
Right. Those stories might be a bit embellished, but they capture this idea that sometimes stepping back can lead to those aha moments.
And then there's insight, which is kind of the culmination of that incubation process, that sudden realization where the solution just clicks into place.
Yeah, and researchers who study problem solving have tried to characterize what makes insight different from other kinds of problem solving.
How so?
While Bowden and others say that insight requires something genuinely new, it involves restructuring how you see the problem, and it often happens after you've hit a wall, after you've been stuck for a while.
It's like you've been staring at the problem from one angle, and then suddenly you shift your perspective and everything becomes clear.
Exactly. And neuroscientists are even trying to pinpoint the specific brain activity that happens during those moments of insight.
Wow. So maybe one day we'll be able to, like, trigger those aha moments on demand.
Maybe it's still early days, but the research is fascinating. And the entry also touches on the stages of evaluation and externalization, which are important, but maybe not quite as mysterious as generation and insight.
Right. Evaluation is about judging whether those new ideas are actually any good, and externalization is about, like, actually putting them out into the world, whether it's writing them down, building a prototype, or creating a work of art.
Exactly. But the entry also includes this really valuable section on current worries and future directions for the cognitive science of creativity.
Okay, so what are some of the challenges facing this field?
Well, there are concerns about the validity of some of the measures they use to study creativity and whether lab studies can really capture the richness of real-world creative processes.
Makes sense. It's hard to replicate the messy, unpredictable nature of creativity in a controlled setting.
Right. And Dietrich has this really interesting critique where he argues that the field might be focusing too narrowly on certain aspects of creativity, like divergent thinking, at the expense of others. He thinks we need a more holistic and interdisciplinary approach that considers the full spectrum of what creativity can be.
So it's not just about coming up with lots of ideas. It's also about selecting the best ones, refining them, and actually bringing them to fruition. Expert.
Yeah.